Michael, you have to start again.
Yeah, I heard that. Hello, my name is Michael Stopa. I'd like to thank you all for coming to our 2019 AmeriCorps Budget webinar. The date is July 17th, 2019. For anyone watching this after the fact, again, thank you all for joining us, and let's start with some housekeeping. First off, all your phones are muted to keep the noise level down. The webinar is being recorded, just so you know that. After the fact, you'll be able to watch the recording. It'll be sent out and also uploaded to our YouTube channel eventually. If at any point you have a question, you can type them in the chat box to send us any questions or comments. But just know we will be saving these for specific times during the webinar to answer said questions. First off, let's just, so you know who you are being presented by, let's introduce ourselves. I'll start off. Again, I'm Michael Stopa. I'm an AmeriCorps Grants Manager, Financial Grants Manager here at YouthBuild USA, and I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Hi, this is Brooke.
Sure, I can jump. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
This is Brooke Mangesh, and I'm also the Financial Manager here at YouthBuild USA.
And this is Johnny Rubago, also Financial Manager here at YouthBuild USA.
And Brandon Keffer, Associate Director of Finance for AmeriCorps.
Okay, thank you guys. Again, if you have any questions, you can ask them in the chat box. We'll be flagging them as questions and then answering them during specific times during the webinar. But we do just ask that you keep these questions general and related to budgeting. If you have questions that pertain to your specific AmeriCorps program or are specific to issues that you are facing that are not generally related to your budget or other aspects of your financial management, you should send those to your FM directly after the webinar via email, phone call, or however you normally get into contact with your FM. Just so we know what we're going over, these are the topics that we'll be covering today. First off, we're going to start off with tips on how to build your budget, then instructions on how to use our provided tools, then understanding your timeline as it pertains to your budget and your AmeriCorps grant, and finally the new financial management survey, which is a new aspect of our monitoring as of this grant year. But first off, we're going to start with a simple poll just so we know our audience a little better. I'm going to ask you to select which of these positions best describes your role at your AmeriCorps program. We're going to give everyone a little bit of time here to answer. Again, just if there isn't one that describes exactly what you do, just pick the one that best describes. It's always nice to know who the field is joining us at any given time. Okay. Okay. Thank you, everyone who has been answering the polls. Let's just take a look at what folks are doing at their YouthBuild programs. It seems the majority of you are accountants or directors of finance. A lot of you selected other, but we got a healthy mix of different roles, and that's what we like to see. We like to see a good mix of folks joining us. So the first thing we like to do is just to go over some general topics that are going to come up during the webinar, just so we don't have to go into some more broad things, and so we don't say words that may confuse you. The first one that we, and the only one that we're going to be covering today, is the concept of RAAD. RAAD is simply our shorthand for understanding whether or not costs can be billed to your AmeriCorps grant or not, and RAAD stands for reasonable, allowable, allocable, and documented. In order for a cost to be billed to your AmeriCorps grant, it has to meet these 4 standards. So if we say RAAD at any point today, just know this is what we're referring to, these 4 key concepts. And with that, we're going to actually start on our actual content for today. I'm going to be starting things off. I'm going to be talking about tips on how to build your AmeriCorps budget. Your budget is, of course, the foundation of your financial management of your grant, and it's important to have that strong foundation in order for you to maximize your ability to protect the investment that both we are making in you and that you're making in your young people, and as well to maximize the impact that your AmeriCorps programs can have. The first thing we're going to show you is that we do have some resources for you, and Barute is going to be talking about these a bit later, but just know that there is a tab in your budget template that looks like this. And this has a bunch of helpful links for you that could be of use to you when building your budget. So if at any point you're confused, you can always tab over to this tab in your budget template, and you should be able to find some tips on how to solve the issues you're facing. So first off, the first thing you're going to see when you open your budget template is this, which I like to call your grant summary. We don't really have a name for it. I kind of decided that myself. And this just has some useful information for you. It's going to include your total number of slots and what those slots are. You can see here that this fake AmeriCorps program has 50 quarter-time slots and 5 half-time slots. It's going to include your total grant award and also your admin and indirect rates for expense and match. To the right of that is another section of the grant summary, and this is going to be how you track progress on your budget. This will update as you fill out different sections of your budget. It'll show you errors that you may have made, but we're going to go over on how to use this tool specifically at the end of my section in a couple of slides here. But first, let's talk about how to budget staff salary. So staff salary is likely going to be the largest portion of your budget. For most AmeriCorps programs, the most of you are billing your time to AmeriCorps, and the majority of your grant award will be made up here. So it's important to fill this section out with as much information as possible and as correctly as possible. So the first thing you should notice is that your clearance date it should be left blank. We will update the clearance date with any clearance date that we have on file, and if we don't have one on file for any staff members, we will ask for the information from you in order to get one. You need to put their total salary as well as an estimation of how much time they will be spending on AmeriCorps any given month, and that in turn will give you your total amount, which you can then split up between expense and match as you need to. One thing that comes up fairly often that we feel the need to bring up is that a lot of your AmeriCorps years are designed to go longer than 12 months. This can be because of rolling enrollment, or maybe because of suspension of members or things like that. So just know that you should take this into consideration when billing for staff salary. I know it says annual salary there. However, that's just because we don't have a better shorthand on how to describe how much salary you will pay somebody over their full AmeriCorps year. So if you know your program's going to go 13 months or 14 months or 15 months, however long it's going to go, you should take that into consideration when entering total salary. So this is a slide to go over the concept of using formulas in your budget. This specific slide is showing you a fringe, entering fringe, and using a specific calculation on that fringe calculation in order to get the exact amount. It's important to use these calculations wherever possible. Anytime you have 3% of something is being billed to AmeriCorps, you should always use 3% of that exact amount. As you can see here, it's 3% of total staff salary. Another important thing here is that you can see that this formula is rounding, and you should always round to the nearest penny. Frequently, people submit budgets that don't do this, and it can cause actually a decent amount of issues with your budget. So always remember to round numbers wherever possible. This next section we're going to go over is contractors and consultants. This is a quick one. Just know that if you are billing for contractors or consultants here in Section F of your budget, you will have to submit an AmeriCorps contractor form. This form can be found in your Dropbox. However, if you have issues accessing it, just let us know and we'll send you one. If you do know you are billing for this, it's important to be proactive. You should submit these with your budget. Don't wait for us to ask for one if you know you're going to be billing for these things. This is where we're going to start talking about RAAD. And supplies is often a section where RAAD comes into play the most because these are where you're buying things and you're billing them to the grant. Just know that things have to be RAAD in order to bill for them, but also we're going to be keeping RAAD in mind when reviewing your budget as well. So when you submit your budget, you should be as clear as what you are paying for as possible. Here you can see it's split up between office supplies, construction supplies, tools and equipment, things like that. If we see something that doesn't look like it might be RAAD, we will contact you in order to get clarification on what this cost is, and they potentially might need to be removed from the budget. If you're ever concerned on if something is RAAD or not, please contact your FM before submitting your budget. We are only a phone call or an email away, and it's better to nip those problems in the bud before they become larger issues or before they cause some back and forth after the budget is submitted. As we said earlier, part of RAAD is allocating costs, and this is what this slide is showing. So it's always important to allocate costs whenever you have to. These are if costs are being split up between multiple funding sources or are being used by programs at your program that are not AmeriCorps. They need to be allocated properly. There's many different ways you can do this. As you can see, this slide shows 3 different ways. It shows allocating per member. It shows allocating by square footage of space used. And it shows allocation by percentage of staff members. It's always just important to always follow your own cost allocation plan and to always reference it whenever you have to. If we see costs that should typically be allocated, such as rent or utility costs, and they're not allocated properly, we will contact you to get clarification, or possibly they will need to be fixed. The next section is one that frequently causes some confusion, and that's billing for indirect. As of this grant year, you now have to opt into billing for indirect, so these sections will be left blank by default. And you have 2 options to choose from. Option A, or method A, is our provided admin rates and indirect costs, and those are, as I said earlier, provided to you in your grant summary. You can see the arrows pointing to those amounts here for this grant award. You will have to enter those manually in order to be able to bill for indirect. However, if your program has their own federally approved indirect rate, you must use it, and you must then fill out method B based on what your federally approved indirect rate is. You should be as clear as what the calculation is that you're using in the calculation box, as well as the base costs to the left of the calculation, as well as inputting your indirect rate, and then it will automatically spread that between the corporate share and the subgrantee share for you. But again, if your program has a federally approved indirect rate, you must use it. Next up, we're going to talk about match. Match is just as important in terms of budgeting as each individual line item is. You must always remember to make sure that you match 100% of your grant. Very frequently we will see people short $1,000 or $2,000. That can't happen. We will contact you in order to make sure that you fix that issue. And we want as much detail as possible when you're listing your match sources. So you see here that it's saying where the source is. It's not saying things like state grant or something like that. If we want to know it's from the Massachusetts Department of Education or the Wisconsin Department of Education or whatever state authority you might be getting a grant from. We want as much information as possible for the purpose as well. So say clearly in the purpose section what that match source is paying for, whether it's paying for staff, these specific staff members, or these specific costs. We want to see what you're spending for with each match source. And just know that if you are using in-kind as match, you should mark it as so here, and you will have to submit an additional form, an in-kind donation form. We'll be talking about that a bit later in the tool section, but just know that's going to be an additionally required section. So let's go back to our grant summary here, and this is a useful cheat sheet that will show you how your grant is shaping up as you're filling out your budget. Once you've completed it, you should check this, as I talked about earlier. And any issues that are currently with your grant budget will show up being highlighted in red. You can see here this example has not met the 50% match requirement and is missing sources of match. So like I said earlier, you have to match 100% of the grant. This is missing both listed match sources as well as actual meeting the budgeted requirement. So if this was submitted to us, we would send this back and say, hey, you need to fix these two sections in order for this grant to be, this budget to be accepted. If we see here in this next slide, these sections have been fixed. This is now, according to the grant summary, okay to be submitted and reviewed by us. Note that if this section is not red, if everything is showing that there are no issues, that does not mean your budget is accepted. Rather, it signals that we can even begin to review the budget at all. We can now actually begin, the budget is complete for us to be reviewed. There could still be issues in it that are not specifically for the things that are caught in this quick little test. One important thing that we need to mention here is that rounding errors can make this section look incomplete, even though to you it might look as though your budget is correct. What I mean by that is that if you did not round a certain section or calculation to the nearest penny, you could be billing for 99% of a penny, in which this section would say, oh wait, they're undermatched, even though you're only a fraction of a penny off. That's going to cause a lot of problems for us because we'll have to figure out exactly where in your budget that's wrong, and then it'll elongate the process a great deal. So always, always, always remember to round to the nearest penny whenever you can. So does anyone have any questions about the section that we just went over before we move on?
Michael, we had a question in the chat box, but it was answered. But just for the group, Lisa Smith asked, how and where do we opt in for method A versus method B for the indirect rate?
Great question. I'm going to go back here to the slide. So as you can see, if you recognize this portion in your budget, the way you opt in to either method A or method B is by completing these lines in your budget. So these are going to be by default blank. And then when you fill out one of them, it'll signify that you are opting into either method A or method B. You can't fill out both. It won't let you. So just know that the way you opt in is by actually budgeting for one of these lines in your budget. Any other questions?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. Then we will move on to Johnny.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Okay. So in this section, I'll be going over how to use our tools to start building your budget. So first, we'll be going over what you need to gather while you're building your budget. I'll show you and briefly go over all the forms you need. Then I'll go over what is required for approval. So the two major things are required. Two major things are required this year in addition to your budget and the various forms. So we'll talk about those too. And lastly, we'll go over some things you need, some things you should keep in mind while you're building your budget. And I'll go over some few tips and reminders on how to submit your budget. Okay, so let's start. So one of the first things you will need to gather is the proper approval and documentation for federally approved indirect rate. So Michael mentioned this a few seconds ago, but you have to submit this federally approved letter if you're going to use a federal indirect cost rate. If you do not have a federally approved indirect cost rate, which is most of you, you will use our 5.26 rate, which is automatically generated in the budget. As Michael showed you, it's on the upper left side of your budget. Again, the formula is automatically generated. You don't have to do anything. You just have to go in there, put it down, copy paste the number down in the spreadsheet towards the bottom if you're opting in for the corporate rate. Okay. So once you have that indirect cost rate, you're going to need written authorization for using federal funding sources. Very small percentage of our programs are using federal money as match, so this might not apply to most of you. Keep in mind that sites will no longer be able to use federal DOL funds for match due to impending guidance from DOL. So this is not very important to most of you, but I'm just putting it out there in case you are using federal funds. If you're using in-kind contributions as match, please make sure to submit that in-kind contribution form that Michael mentioned and all the supporting documentation. So appraisals, descriptions, and all the other backup documentation. And you can find this form in Dropbox. And lastly, if you're using contractors, you will need to submit this contractor form shown here and all the supporting documentation. Again, descriptions and value of service. Everything is detailed in the forms. And just to quickly review, these are the forms you'll need to gather. You need the federally approved indirect cost rate letter saying that that this is approved. And again, this is a very small percentage of you guys. You'll need the written authorization to use federal funding. Again, doesn't apply to most of you guys. The in-kind commitment letter and form if you're using in-kind as match. And if you're using contractors, that outside contractor form and that supporting documentation. You'll find all of these forms in Dropbox. We're updating them for this new grant year. If you check your AmeriCorps folder, you'll see all of them in there. If not, please contact your financial manager. Okay, moving on. What you need for approval. So besides completing your budget and submitting all the various required forms, you also need a few things from you guys, and that's the most recent audit, your criminal history checks, and your financial management survey. I won't be going over the financial management survey. Brandon will cover it in a few minutes. But when you submit your budget, you're required to submit your most recent audit. If you do not have your most recent audit, you will state this in the survey. Again, Brandon will go over this in a few moments. But a budget cannot be approved without this audit. In addition to the audit, you will need to start clearing all criminal history checks for everyone in the budget. So we're going with a different method of clearing checks this year, mandated by the corporation. We're moving forward with TrueScreen and Field Print to process these checks. There are some exceptions, but please contact your PM for more information. This process is out of our control as financial managers. We just get that confirmation from your program manager. So it's something to keep in mind. And on the screen, you'll see the graphic representation of sort of our process, the way it works. So you have to contact your financial manager and program manager to start the CHC process. Then your program manager will process that documentation on their end, and we, financial managers, add that staff name to the budget, expense and match, and staff summary, and then we wait for your program manager's confirmation date. So the sooner we get these, the sooner we can start billing. But it's after that confirmation date that you can start billing. So a good rule of thumb you can follow is that you can email your program manager and CC your financial manager if you need to add anyone to the budget. This will reduce delays in the process and mitigate the risk of miscommunication. Again, FNs will add the names to the spreadsheets. PMs will provide that confirmation date later. Okay, moving on. Some things to keep in mind while you're building your budget is the OMB circulars. Most of you know what is allowable and what is not. Remember that question costs, like Michael said, will delay everything. So when in doubt, contact us. We're only a phone call away, or you can shoot us an email. So I won't go over what's allowable and what's not allowable. We have a separate slide deck dedicated to this. So please contact us for more information. But a good rule of thumb would be is to keep things RAAD, reasonable, allowable, allocable, and documented.
Sent me off 3 or 4 times.
Okay. Can someone mute that? Thank you. Okay. Okay, so that brings me to knowing the flow. So I want to emphasize how important the budget is for everything that we do. Everything is interconnected. I know it might seem novel to some of you, but for those new to the grant, I want to make it clear that all spreadsheets feed into each other. For example, when you want to change the budget for, let's say, you're adding someone new, we have to change the budget, which changes the expense and match report, and that automatically changes the FSR that needs to be signed every time it's changed. So please be mindful of this when you're budgeting for the grant. The budget is the most important piece of submitting your AmeriCorps reimbursement report. It dictates what you need to change, and we'll be going over this in more detail in our next webinar. Okay, lastly, where do we submit all of this? Okay, so once you're done gathering all the forms and letters and backup documentations for those forms, you'll be submitting this to us via email, and then we'll upload everything to Dropbox. So everyone on this webinar has access to Dropbox. If you do not, please contact your FM as soon as possible. In Dropbox, you'll see the folder for each grant year. Within those folders, you'll see subfolders with each month. You'll find your approved budget in the approved budget folder, and the expense and match workbook in the expense and match workbook folder, and so on and so forth. You'll see the new grant year folder structure, the 1920 structure, once you're done with your budget, which you'll be sending to us again via email. As a reminder, you'll find all the forms from this webinar, the contractor form, all of those forms, and other helpful resources in Dropbox as well. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Do we have any questions?
Yes, so there were a few questions in regards to the indirect rates. I would say if you're currently building your budget and you have an approved indirect cost rate, it may be a good idea just to reach out to your FM to see how that can be applied in your budget. It can be a little bit confusing depending on what your rate is and what it can be applied to. But to put it very simply, 5.26% is the cap for indirect on the federal share, also known as the expense side of the budget. And then if you have an indirect cost rate, you could use that remainder on the match side of the budget. And for those programs who do not have a federally approved indirect cost rate, then you can take advantage of the 10% de minimis rate. Now, if all of that is completely confusing, reach out to your FM and we can sort of get that rate established first before you build the rest of your budgets.
Just a quick addendum to Brandon's comment. If you are using Method B and you have your own federally approved indirect cost rate, it will automatically fill out the 5.26% into the expense side, and then the remainder will then be automatically filled out in the match portion based on what you fill out in the calculation and percentage fields of Method B. So you don't have to worry about calculating that 5.26% and then worrying about what the remainder is. The budget template will handle that calculation for you.
All right, and as far as backup documentation for indirect costs, there's no backup documentation required. However, if you do have an approved indirect cost rate, we would just need the actual letter as proof so we can see the rate and see what it applies to in your budget. All right, so there's no...
Have to see once.
And that's just something we would have to see once at the beginning of the process. That's not something you would have to submit every month.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, thank you. Brandon, thank you, everyone.
All right. So moving on, it wouldn't be a true AmeriCorps Fiscal webinar if we didn't at least mention the rules and regulations. So now that we're in budget season, it's always good practice to just review federal uniform guidance. Take a look at the AmeriCorps terms and conditions just to make sure that you are budgeting for allowable expenses. So as far as fiscal requirements laid out in the AmeriCorps terms, it really points to two key areas in uniform guidance that really applies to anyone receiving federal funding. And so those two areas are financial management, so the financial management systems at your program, and the allowability of costs. So those are the two big areas. So quick question for the audience, and you can use the chat box to respond. What are some examples of things that would fall under the term financial management? So I know that's a very broad question, but what are some things that come to mind? It could be policies, procedures, actual systems you use. What falls under the financial management of a federal grant? Give me some examples. I'll give you guys a few seconds to think. Yep, someone said procurement, allowable costs. Great, yep, cost allocation. These are all great answers. See if anyone can think of a few more. Reasonable cost, yep. So to put it simply, a strong financial management system is able to distinguish expenditures that are attributable to this award from expenditures that are not attributable to this award. So in other words, you have systems in place to identify costs by the program year of the grant. You can track it by budget category, and you can distinguish between direct and indirect expenses. All right. So we had a few great examples. So for example, you would have policies such as a procurement policy, a cost allocation plan, and travel policies, just to name a few. So when it comes to financial management of a federal award, the main concern is being able to distinguish those costs. And then we have allowability of costs. So do your expenses meet the criteria of an allowable cost under uniform guidance? And the AmeriCorps team always uses the acronym RAAD, R-A-A-D. So are your expenses reasonable? Are they allowable? Are they allocable? And are they documented? So the purpose of our monitoring process is to really help mitigate the risk of disallowed costs in the event of an audit or investigation. So I'll give you some stats on our 2005 audit just to give you some context around potential disallowed costs. So here we have some information from our 2005 audit. OIG audits are lengthy. They can take a few years. In this particular audit, the auditors looked at 2001 through 2004 files, and the audit closed in 2008. So in that time, auditors spent 5 weeks at YouthBuild USA offices, visited 5 of our subgrantees. So audits tend to be periods of intense, concentrated work and focus, and then years of silence and waiting. And then you finally get the question costs. So here's the breakdown of the question costs and disallowed costs. So in the response from the auditors, there was a total of $6.5 million in question costs. We went through the resolution process and got that down to a total repayment to CNCS of just over $106,000. $72,000 of that was a disallowed cost payments for things that were in the AmeriCorps budget, and the remainder was the cost of the ed awards that had to be repaid. So while YouthBuild USA is not specifically responsible for paying back disallowed costs, as the prime grantee, we are responsible for collecting repayment from subgrantees. And I believe in this case, a payment plan was established to recoup those disallowed costs. So that leads us into an update for grant year 19-20, introducing the Financial Management Survey. So why are we doing this survey? It's YouthBuild USA's responsibility as the pass-through entity of these federal funds to assess the risk of subrecipients at the outset of a grant cycle. And then from there, we'll be updating this on an annual basis. So what are we going to use this survey for? The survey will first allow you to get a sense of your own compliance risk, and it will serve as a baseline for our training and monitoring process. So depending on what we see in the survey, we may choose to provide training and technical assistance on a more frequent basis. We may choose to perform on-site program reviews of operations, or we may arrange for agreed upon procedures to be created and implemented. So this survey is currently available. You should have seen a link in your budget email as well as the grant startup email. You can find the actual documents on the AmeriCorps Grant Startup webpage. So let's take a quick look at the survey. We've got 5 sections. First section, maybe the first and most obvious requirement is for us to assess your most recent audits. So it's our responsibility to make sure the program is following up on any audit findings or other issues revealed in that process. So in this section, you'll tell us whether or not you are subject to a single audit, when your next audit is available, and finally, if there were any findings in the audit, and was there a response required from management. So if you're wondering if we have your most recent audit on file, you can refer to your budget email. We should have let you know the date of the most recent audit we have on file. If you have anything more recent than that, then send it our way. Section B, Part B, Written Policies. In this section, you'll simply upload a copy of the following policies to the Financial Management Survey folder, which you can find in your Fiscal Dropbox. So the first written policy is internal controls. So internal controls, they are the first line of defense in safeguarding assets. It's the methods for detecting and preventing mistakes and minimizing opportunities for fraud. So an example of this would be separation of duties. So who signs the checks, who makes the deposit, who authorizes checks, how many signatures do you need, how is it documented? Next up, and as someone mentioned in the chat box, procurement policy. So the purchase of goods and services need to be conducted in an open and competitive environment just to ensure that prices paid are fair and reasonable. So this policy typically references different dollar thresholds and what is required when pricing out your options. So an example of this, looking at a policy, you may have a small purchase procedure. So this would apply to anything over $10,000 but under $250,000. And these are all dollar thresholds set by the federal government. So under this small purchase procedure, you would need to obtain at least 2 bids before you actually made the purchase. And these bids could be informal, they could be a web search or phone call. It just needs to be documented. So that is procurement. Next up, travel policies, very straightforward. What is the process and procedure for approving staff travel, meal expenses? After that, we have conflict of interest, very standard policy. Hopefully most organizations have this. It's one of the most important for a board to adopt. This protects the organization from any charges of impropriety. For example, let's say a board member is influencing a director's decision to sign a contract with that board member's business. So that would be an example of conflict of interest. So a policy like this would help bring this type of thing to light in order to protect the reputation of the program. Next up, we have cost allocation plan. I think someone else also mentioned this in the chat box. This is a key compliance area in uniform guidance, the ability to distinguish funding sources by program and program year. So do you have a policy and procedure in place to track those costs? So an example here would be how you distinguish Department of Labor funds from AmeriCorps funds. How are operational costs like rent and utilities allocated across funding sources? How is staff time reported and tracked across funding sources? And finally, an org chart to give us a sense of how the program operates and who we should connect with should there be any problems. All right, that takes care of written policies. Up next, Part C, funds management. Let's see. So a few example questions of what you can find here. Does your accounting system track the receipts and disbursement of funds by each grant or funding source? Does your accounting system enable you to track and document the disbursement of funds from the original invoice all the way through till final payments? Another question you'll see on the survey, are personnel activity reports, aka timesheets, maintained by funding source and project for each employee, and does it account for their entire time devoted to your organization? Next up, Part D, internal controls. So a few specific questions. You'll be uploading your internal controls as part of the written policies, but this section will simply highlight some of those key internal controls that absolutely must be in place to proceed with reimbursements. So for example, are duties of the accountant bookkeeper separate from cash functions, so the receipts and payment of cash? Are checks signed by individuals whose duties exclude recording cash received and approving vouchers? And are cash or in-kind match funds supported by appropriate documentation? And then finally, Part E, match monitoring. So you may have already come to know that match is an inherent area of risk. It's not uncommon for organizations to struggle with tracking match, and OIG auditors are certainly aware of that fact. So match funds were a major focus in both the 2005 audit and the current audits that YouthBuild USA is currently undergoing. So ideally, your organization would have written policies in place that address all areas of concern for monitoring your match funds. So this section will allow you to explain your process in the event that written policies are not yet established or sufficient. So you'll have a few fields in the survey where you can explain that process in more detail. So some examples of what you'll see in that section is, how is AmeriCorps match budgeted? Do you capture match in the general ledger? Does the organization have a written cost allocation plan that describes how you allocate across multiple funding sources? And how is match determined for staff time? So that covers all sections of the financial management survey. Hopefully you've all received this or located it. Once complete, you should be able to find a folder in your AmeriCorps Fiscal Dropbox called Financial Management Survey. That is where you can upload the survey. You can upload the most recent copy of your audits, as well as all of those various written policies that I mentioned. So the due date for this is August 9th. It's, I believe it's the same day that your budget is due. So I will stop here. Any questions about this? Or I think there were some questions about indirect cost rates as well.
Yeah. David has a clarifying question about indirect cost rates. I'm just going to read his question verbatim. Just to clarify, indirect cost rate method B says if you have an improved ICR and you choose to use it, but what I'm hearing now is going forward we have to use method B in order if we have an approved indirect cost rate. Brandon, would you mind?
Yeah, I think there's been some miscommunications about this in the past. What my understanding currently is that you do not have to use your indirect cost rates. However, if you do have an indirect cost rate, you can't take advantage of the 10% de minimis. The most you could do is use the 5.26% on the expense side. And hopefully that answers your question, but David, we can certainly talk offline about that if you want to take a look at your budget specifically.
It doesn't appear
okay, any other
we have
questions?
Any questions? It does not appear so.
Okay, I will hand things over to Brooke Tate then.
Thank you. So now that we have covered how to build your AmeriCorps budget, in this next section we will look at grant timeline. This would help you answer questions like when will I start enrolling members to the new grant year, and when to start submitting AmeriCorps reimbursement requests. So we will cover grant enrollment period, member service year, as well as grant expenditure period. Let's start with enrollment period. This is the 1-year period of time that AmeriCorps program has to enroll its AmeriCorps member positions or slots for 2019 to 2020 grant year, the upcoming new grant. The grant enrollment period is August 15th, 2019 to August 14th, 2020. What this means is the program will have this 1 year to enroll members, and you will be able to enroll members anytime within this 1 year timeline. For instance, you could enroll a member in November 2019 or February 2020 or June 2020. Next will be the member service year. This is a 1 year period of time that an AmeriCorps member has to complete their service requirement. The 1 year starts on the day of enrollment at any period during the grant enrollment period. So for grant year 2019, 2020, the enrollment period, as I mentioned, starts August 15th, 2019, and ends August 14th, 2020. So the member service year could start any time on the enrollment day, and it will go for 1 year. So in this specific example, if you have a member enrolled in November 2019, their service year will run until October 31st, 2020. So the two key points to remember about member service year, it's a 1 year period, and it can start any time during the enrollment period. Let's look at grant expenditure period. Grant expenditure period is a period which coincides with a program having active 2019-2020 members. The grant period is similar to a member enrollment period. For this upcoming new grant, it will start on August 15th. The subgrantee may continue to submit reimbursement requests as long as it has active members in the grant period still serving with the program. So the grant expenditure period will start 30 days before the member starts his or her service, and it ends 30 days after the member has exited the program. Once the last 2019-2020 member has exited service, the program may not expand any additional grant funds after the 30-day period. So in this specific example, for a member who is enrolled in November 2019, a program can start billing to the grant 30 days prior, which is October 31st, and it will continue to bill 30 days after the exit date, which is in this case October 31st, 2020. So the two important key points to keep in mind about grant expenditure period is money follows member, and also remember the 30-day period. You can start billing 30 days before the enrollment and 30 days after the member exit date. As you can imagine, due to this enrollment period and expenditure period, we can have overlapping grant years. Currently, most of our programs, if not all our programs, have overlapping grant years. At least they will have 2 grant years open. We are encouraging programs to close out their 2017-18 grant year by September 30th. This would help you have only 2 grant years open, and it will facilitate your monthly grant reimbursement submissions. Any questions so far? Okay. So far we have covered enrollment period, member service year, and grant expenditure. I'm just going to ask a few questions to test your knowledge. You can just type the answers in the comment in the chat section. When is the start of the 2019-2020 grant enrollment period? Perfect. We're getting answers in. Wonderful. So the grant enrollment period, as I mentioned, will start August 15th, 2019, and it will go all the way to August 14th, 2020. And the next question is, how long does an AmeriCorps member has to finish their member service requirement? Yes, the answer is 1 year. Next quick question is, if your last active member leaves the program on March, sorry, I think the question is cut. On March, I guess you can see the question. When will be the last day you can bill the grant? Yeah. So the 30-day, in this case, when you apply the 30-day rule, it will be March 31st, 2020. Perfect. So now that we have gone over these 3 key points, I also want to cover some best practices while you are working on building your 2019-2020 grant. It's very important to have a strong program fiscal communication. This is especially key when you are doing background check, and also when you are building your personnel expenses, to really speak with your program staff members about the grant expenditure period and when you expect to enroll members. Another best practice would be to submit supporting documentation along with the draft budget. That would include the financial management survey, any in-kind documentations you have, the indirect rate if you have it. So if you review the email we sent out with the budget template, we have outlined the kind of supporting documentation you would need to submit. Please follow that, and if you submit all your documentation together with the draft budget, it will really facilitate the approval process. Just keep in mind the draft budget is due August 9, similar to the financial management survey. I also wanted to remind you some of the resources we have, especially the fiscal help doc. We always had this, but I think we have been adding new content to it and making it very accessible to programs. I have included a link here, so once we have this PowerPoint uploaded, you can access it using the link. We have over 50 articles covering different topics, including how to add a new staff member to the grant, how to utilize your grant, as well as how to charge overtime, you name it. Different array of topics are covered, and it could be a good stop for any program or fiscal person who have any question regarding charging any expenses to the grant. Other resources we have mentioned a lot about the Dropbox. Once your budget is approved, you will have access to your 2019-2020 grant folder in the Dropbox. And as Johnny mentioned, if you do not have access to a Dropbox, your program's Dropbox, please reach out to one of us. We also have a grant startup page. The link is included here, as well as our YouTube channel. I don't know if you have attended our last webinar around match. That webinar is already on our YouTube channel, and this webinar will be included in that as well. We also have a bi-weekly newsletter. The newsletter is emailed out to our fiscal and program contacts. We cover a variety of topics. Our latest newsletter covered topics like how to, what the kind of documentation you need to send around in-kind match contribution. So you might find this very helpful. We also include announcements such as upcoming conferences and webinars like this one. So if you haven't received our weekly newsletter, also reach out to us so we could include your email address to our list. So finally, this is us. Please reach out to us if you have any question. We are accessible via phone or email. I hope you found this webinar very helpful. Does anyone have any questions so far?
No additional questions in the chat box, but we can stick around for a while if any of you want to sort of hang out and ask a few questions. But we're certainly available individually, or you can always email AmeriCorpsFSR@youthbuild.org. That will be the team email.
And another quick plug, we will be having a webinar in the fall related to the billing and month-to-month management of your AmeriCorps grant. So please look out for the information about that around October, November. We're going to be going into in-depth on how to manage your AmeriCorps grant. Kathy asked, will the PowerPoint be available? Yes, both of the slides will be available to you, as well as a recording of the entire webinar will be made available to you at a later date. We'll be able to send those slides to you if you want them.
Yep, we should be able to send an email to all participants so we can send you some resources. But I would definitely look out for the AmeriCorps newsletter where we'll upload a copy of this recording as well as some additional other resources. All right, well, if that's it, I think we'll end there. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll hang out for a little bit if you happen to have any questions. But take care. Thank you.
Thank you.